All right, we'll get started here. Lights? No? It doesn't matter. I'm Steve Jones. I run SQLServerCentral.com. I started that site about 10 years ago, and that's really what I've been doing for the last, 8 or so years full time. And I work for Redgate Software. They bought my company a few years ago, and so that's why I got invited here to speak. I'm going to talk about always on and contained databases here today. It's mostly contained databases though, so if you're hoping for mostly always on, my apologies, it's not what's going to be there. In the deck, if you download it, they have a lot of references to different URLs for text or for video that may show you how to set it up or show you demos and things. I don't demo always on just because it tends to fail. I've like 8 or 9 times that I've seen people demo it, including the people at Microsoft. Something always breaks. So I don't like breaking demos. Try not to break demos, so I'm not going to do it. But we'll talk about it a little bit. All right, first we'll talk about containment. I'll start there and what that means in contained databases. We'll go into always on a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about how things fit together. There's not a lot of discussion there. There's not a lot of discussion with Redgate, but you know, Redgate pays my salary, so buy Redgate. All right. A lot of times we move databases. We move them from different servers. We have different purposes. They fail over. We're doing disaster recovery. We're doing testing, any number of things we do. And one of the most common things that happens, any guesses? Anybody know where things go wrong? Security, right? And really with security, what we're talking about is orphaned users. It's not a big deal. It's really not that big a deal, but it's really annoying and it's a hassle and it causes problems. And if you were here earlier, you know one of the things that I hate is I hate for my phone to ring. And when I have orphan users, usually my phone starts ringing. Your phone rings. People get annoyed by it. And it's crazy because it's 2012. SQL Server's been around for 22 years. We've had 11 versions now. I'll have to think about that for a minute. And we still have this problem, and it's kind of crazy. And it's not that hard. Is anybody here from Microsoft out of curiosity? Before I get in trouble? But there's no excuse for this to really happen. There's plenty of ways around this problem. There's plenty of things that could be done, but Microsoft, I don't think, has done a great job in providing us a tool set that handles some of these things or that mitigates the issues. They're getting better. Hopefully they'll continue to get better. But a lot of times what happens is something like this, and this is the reason that it fails from our side, from the DBA side. I've got a primary server of some sort, right? Maybe it's a high availability system or something. Working along, and somebody calls me and says, new guy started, I need to make a login for him, right? No big deal. Write a script, very easy to do. Build him a login, and then my phone rings, right? And I get busy, but this is a pretty easy process, so it completes. We got a new user, send him a note, he gets going. Of course, then I need more coffee, because we like coffee as DBAs, right? IT people, we love coffee. And then it's lunchtime. Does anybody work over lunch? Closed at lunch, right? We're busy. We've got a lot of things on our mind, a lot of different work, and I forgot about my secondary server, my high availability server. And I know none of you would ever do that. But across time, as you get busy and you support 10 systems and you've got hundreds of users and you have different tasks to do every day and somebody says, just add this one guy today, you're going to forget this here and there. And guess which system is going to fail? The one where you forgot this guy. Okay? And then he's going to call you, and if you're like me, it's like the CIO and he's trying to run a financial report and he's like, why doesn't this work? It's embarrassing, it feels unprofessional, and it makes my phone ring, which is what I hate the most. As far as fixing it, it's easy to fix. There's any number of ways we do this. We have some tools that help us detect what the problem is, but they don't fix it. SP Change User Login is one of the tools that we use. Probably most of you have run that at some point in time. If we actually have to worry about matching up SIDs or we have to worry about passwords, we have SP Help Rev Login from Microsoft. If you've never used that, it's really easy to use, but that's a very, very handy script to keep around in your organization. We can fail to known hardware where we just say we're always going to make sure that we've got a spare box around and we're only going to fail to this box. So we know that we've got all the logins and users there ahead of time. We've tested it. We've made sure that they're there. It doesn't prevent the problem, but it mitigates it. And then I've seen some really creative uses of DDL triggers or a similar type of auditing process that will actually capture the create login event, create a service broker message, send a message that says we created this login, On the other side, there'll be an activation procedure that will pick up the login or pick up the message and create the login. Okay? There's some very slick things you can do with messaging. If you've never played with Service Broker, you might look at it because it solves a lot of these problems. There are maintenance tasks, any kinds of things that you need to transfer to another system. Service Broker works great. It's not perfect. If you have disaster recovery in your queues, it's a little complex, right? Takes some work, but it can be used. Redgate, obviously, I work for Redgate. We have tools that will help you fix this. Compare tools, our SQL Compare will look at logins and users and tell you where they're different if you run that periodically. You could actually script that if you want. We have an API for SQL Compare. And then we can use something like source control where I'm making changes and I want to track the changes that I'm making and I make sure that they roll them forward as I move to other systems. It doesn't help with failover, but it can help you to mitigate this problem.
Steve?
Yes, sir.
Multi-server queries to facilitate the logins against the databases that need to have the...
That's a good point. You could use multi-server queries. In SQL Server 2008 beyond, there's a thing called Central Management Server where you can connect to multiple servers and run a query across multiple servers. Redgate also makes a tool. If any of you have the developer bundle or I think the tool belt, there's a thing called multi-script that will actually run a script against multiple servers. I hesitate to do that because the reason, if you're like me, you'll have a script that needs to run against these 4 servers and then a different script that runs against 2 of those and 2 more. And what you'll do is you'll run the wrong script against the wrong server. Got to be careful. It can work, but you got to be really careful with it. So what's containment or contained databases? The idea in containment is that everything inside the database is self-contained and it doesn't require anything from the instance or it doesn't require anything outside of the database. So my authentication, any references like linked servers, Service Broker queues, things like that, I don't require. And then potentially anything in automation. If I need certain processes to run on a database on a schedule, they're contained within the database. And if I move that database, all that information moves to the new server, the new host. Does that make sense? Okay. If it doesn't make sense, raise your hand. Okay. The official definition from SQL Server 2012 is here. There's a link. You can go read more about it if you want. I'm not going to read a slide. I assume you guys can read this. Okay. If you can't, too bad. But I'll make a picture for you. So in SQL Server, this is the way the system is built. We have an instance that acts as a container or a bundle for databases. It gets a little confusing when we talk containment and containers, but essentially this is the way it is. Some relational systems don't work like this, where the instance and the database are matched up, and if I want another database, I need another instance. Okay? SQL Server isn't like that. We can have multiple databases in an instance. If any of your system administrators don't believe that, and you've probably met a few of those, which is why you manage 80 SQL servers and not 30 SQL servers, you don't need to do that. You can put multiple databases in there. But outside of our databases, we have stuff that lives at an instance level. We have logins. We have linked servers. We have automation, jobs and packages and plans, things that are outside the database. And when I move a database, none of that stuff moves with me. My tables, my views, my programmability objects, all that stuff moves. But all this stuff at the instance level doesn't move, and that causes us problems. Actually, it pays the bills, right, because we get paid to move this stuff, but it's a hassle. It would be nice if all this stuff moved. SQL Server 2012, we take the first step to actually fixing some of these problems that have plagued us for years. Okay? We get what were called partially contained databases. Some places in the documentation it does say contained databases, some places it says partially. What we always get is partially. We get security solved, we get users solved, and then we get collation fixed. This is the UK, so you guys probably deal with multiple collations. In the US, we just don't do that. You either speak SQL, Latin, one general language, or we don't host your databases. Right? But you guys, right, you've got the European Union and all this stuff, so collation could be an issue, especially as you do consolidation or as you move to things like the cloud where you may host applications from multiple countries or multiple environments and you have collation issues. And we'll talk about what each of these means. So for security, in contained database or partially contained databases, the users are stored in the database like they are now. Difference is they get authenticated by the database, not by the instance. Sort of. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Thing is, you can do both Windows authentication and SQL authentication. Now this lovely flow chart, you guys all read that? Can you read it? You're not even looking. You give up. Right? I know you can't read this, so I made it bigger, just for you guys. The way this works is, in SQL Server 2012, the authentication mechanism can vary. It's not the same, and it depends on how you connect. So when we get a connection request here, the first thing SQL Server does in 2012 is it says, is there initial catalog specified? I know all of you guys are fantastic, diligent, meticulous administrators, and you always specify the initial catalog in your connection string, right? And all your developers always specify the initial catalog? No, you guys are lying. Almost nobody does this. Everybody goes default database, we're just going to live with that. They either do a server name and -e, or they do a user and a password and a server name, and that's it. Okay? 2012, it's important that you specify the initial catalog, and you should always do this. It's a great habit to get into. And if your developers come to you with a connection string that doesn't have an initial catalog, please send it back and say, you've got to pick a database. Okay? What happens if I haven't done that, I can't use containment, because immediately what happens is we follow that arrow to the right or to your left, and we go to server level authentication, the same as we have today. Now, if I have specified it, the server looks at that database, that initial catalog, and says, is it a contained database? And I'll show you how to check that in a moment. If not, I go back to server level authentication, because obviously it's not a contained database, we don't care. If it is, we're going to drop down and check it on our authentication type. That's up here. I've just moved the thing up a little bit. These work differently on each side. On the SQL authentication side, right, user and password provided, if I have a user that matches the contained database, I will authenticate them in the contained database. I'll actually get into this password area and decide if they connect or not connect. Right? Makes sense. If the user isn't in that contained database, I'll go to server level authentication. I'll see if there's actually a user that matches the login, right? The reason we do it this way is because if somebody's trying to connect to this database as a contained user, I want to make sure they get to that database as a contained user. Potentially, there's a user with the same name at the server level that isn't in that contained database, right? I could have a different level of authentication. Most of us typically say the login name equals the username. You don't have to do that. There's no reason those have to match. Hey, we do it because, well, we want to try to figure it out later and we want to know what matches, but you don't have to do that. And that's one of the issues here, is that potentially you could have a contained database moving with a user that exists on this the new instance with the same name. Okay, and this is how we determine if they actually get their rights in the contained database or they get their rights at the server level. All right, sounds confusing. If you download this and read the text of this blog post where this image is from, it'll make a little more sense. If it doesn't, send Neil a note. He's a really smart consultant in the UK. He'll explain it to you. In the Windows side, we do it a little bit differently. Here, if I match the login, I check the contained database. But on the Windows side, if I find a matching login, I go to server level authentication. Because for Windows logins, I can't have that mismatch. The login name has to matter because of the token at the directory services level. So if I find a match for the Windows side, I'm going to do server level authentication first and have rights to the whole server instance. If I don't find a match, then I check just in this contained database, because at that point in time, this Windows user doesn't have rights on the instance. They're only going to have rights in the contained database. All right? A few of you look really confused. But if you think about it after this, it'll make more sense why these two are reversed. All right, where I check for my authentication. For collation, when you create a temporary object, what happens is the collation of that object, if you haven't specified it, is created with the instance level collation. Okay? Most times it's not a big deal. We create databases on our instance so the collations match. But if I move a database, I have the potential for the collation not to match at the database and the instance level. When that happens, if I haven't specified collation in my query, or I haven't specified a specific collation when I create a temporary object, I get this message. I can't resolve the collation. And I'm going to show you how this works now, hence the demo. All right. So I'm going to create a little database here, nothing magic here. Oops. It didn't create. I don't think it did. Let's see. All right, it already exists. That's fine. So I'm going to create this login. It already exists. I didn't delete it there. So there's nothing magic here, right? I just created a login. Let's use our database. We're already there. We're going to create a user, and we're going to create a table. I'm going to insert data. We create a role. What did I do here?
Should have stuck always on tennis.
Already exists.
Am I in the right one? Hold on. Let me think for a minute.
Should delete.
All right. I could fix this really quickly. Here, watch this. Now it'll work. All right, so create a database. I don't need to create the login because it'll actually exist there. I'm not going to mess with that. But we'll use this, and we're going to create a user, create a table, create a role, okay? Nothing magic. We do this every day, right? We create tables, create roles. You guys always create roles, right? Nobody assigns rights to users, ever, ever, never. Don't do that, okay? Always assign rights to roles. So I'm going to assign rights to the role here, okay? We always do that. We add people to roles, okay? The reason you do this is because people quit, people start. If one person wants access, I guarantee you the next guy wants access. So always use a role, even if it's for one person. Just use a role. It makes life easier, okay? Just to say, we'll change to this user, we'll run a query, have rights, normal stuff that we always see. So I run a little backup. Nothing special here. And I'm going to go to my second instance, I'm going to restore it. In this case, let's just connect over here. Let's make sure our database doesn't exist. Instance number 2. And we'll do a restore. I'm only showing you this way because there's one cool thing in 2012 that Microsoft did well that solved some problems. Actually, before we do that, so I don't want to give rights to my instances to go to any other folder. So in this case, I have 2 instances, and I don't want instance 2 to have access to instance 1's files. All right, just a good security practice there. So I have to move this backup file as soon as my Explorer wakes up. Virtual machines are fun some days. Come on. All right, somebody was messing with my machine, I think. Where's my backup?
Maybe it's not this location.
Oops. Hello. It is possessed. Look at that. Let me just make sure I was on the right instance there. Really, this usually works. Oh, I was on a new instance. That's why it's flaking out. Let's do this. All right, so let me connect to my first instance. That's why it was acting funny. All right, all that stuff that I just said, whoops. Yeah. So all this stuff, we're just going to run this again.
Even the login?
Huh?
Even the login?
Yeah. There we go. Today's the 14th, right? You notice the date's written there correctly, month, day, year, just so you know. I know. Americans are doing it backwards. So I'm going to paste this. I'm going to replace this over here. So here's my second instance. In this case, obviously, I'm going to have to whack this. This is nice. This is a nice addition if you haven't seen this, close existing connections. Is it in 2008? Yeah. It wasn't in 2005 though. That was really annoying. All right, so we'll do a restore. Pick my device, da-da-da-da, we'll add this in there, and nice thing here is finally you don't have to worry about forgetting what the pathing is, right, or worry about moving the files. If I go to a new instance and I've got different drives, different LUNs that are mapped, I can just use the defaults for my new instance here by clicking this box, which is just kind of cool. It just makes life easier. So we restore this, and this is the kind of stuff that you guys do periodically. Test environment, I got to take production, move it to test. I got to move from one box to another one. I have a disaster and I have to recover. And I go in there, and what happens, if I connect to this particular instance, let's switch back to this instance, my new instance. And I'm going to change my user, right? I'm going to go to, let's go to this database here. Change my user. I'm going to run my query. Right, I've restored a database over here and I run it and everything's fine. Right? Just works great. Doesn't work great. Right? Why not? Well, on this instance, let's refresh it so it's there. The principle's there because I created it there, but it doesn't match up. The SID doesn't match up. Now I can fix it. I can remap it. If it didn't exist, I could create it, SP helper, have a log, and any number of things I can do. But I've got this problem where I've actually created an orphan login here if I just report it, right? It's just a problem that we have constantly. So how does containment fix this? Well, I have this script here. I'm not going to run it because it's already set, but we have a new SP configure option here that's contain databases. And if you look at the instance level, I'm just going to whack this because I'm going to use it in a minute. At the instance level, I've got an SP configure item for containment. It's in here. You can run SP configure as well. Do I have, oh, look at that. Containment. It's true or false. It's set 1 or 0 as SP configure. When you turn this on, it means that I'm going to change my authentication mechanism now. So we're going to check if there's an initial catalog, what you're providing, all that other stuff in there. And then I have the ability to contain databases. So here I'm going to create a contained database. Let's go back to make sure I'm in the right instance because I don't want to do that. I'm going to create and alter this database. Okay, there's nothing magic here. It's just create a database using all defaults, and then I'm altering it to set the containment here. You can actually do this in the create statement, and I'll show you that in a minute. We'll check the properties because that's what it says to do. At the database level, this has changed slightly. So I have my recovery model, my collation, but I also have containment here. I assume at some point this will say full or in Microsoft like mostly or something else, but right now you only have two options, right? None is the way the database exists now. Partial allows partial containment, right? And that allows that authentication to occur in that flowchart. So now I'm going to use this database and I'm going to create a user, okay? If you notice this statement, I create a user with a password. We've never been able to do that before. We've always created a user for a login or for a certificate, something else. Now I can actually do the password and store it inside my database. If I look at that user, just so that you can see, if I can get there, my user is a SQL user with a password. Okay? Notice I don't have some of the password stuff at the instance level. So that's not fixed, right? I can't expire this password, certain things. But if I change this password, it will look at the instance level settings and say, all right, is it old or something? There is some metadata there. But as far as right here, when I create this user and contain database, I just specify the password in here, and then all the other normal user stuff that you're used to seeing.
And this works exactly the same for Windows as well.
Yeah. So, if I create a new user now, if we go here, oops. sorry, clicking the wrong button here. I have these different options. So I can create a normal user, which is a user with a login. A contained user is user with a password, and then the rest of those are the normal stuff that you expect. Okay. The Windows user, as you know, if he matches at the server level, we authenticate at the server level. Otherwise, we authenticate here as a contained user, and it uses the normal Windows authentication with Kerberos and everything else. All right. So let's do the same thing we did before. We're going to create a table in this database. We're going to, do a role because we always use roles, right? Make sure you understand that. Add the user to the role. Da-da-da-da. And we'll do the same set user thing here, right? The stuff we normally do. I can, if I would like, add, let me just do this so we can see it. We'll add a user with a login. And I'm going to pick my old user that we know exists on this instance. My good friend John. If I look at these guys inside of the database, this is a new DMV that's inside the database. What you'll see here I've got my two users at 6 and 8 here that I created. They're both SQL users, if you go across. But I have authentication type of 2 now, which is new for contained database. That tells me this is a contained user. My other user is 1, and you can see over the lookup in SQL Server tells me it's a database or an instance level authentication for this user. So as I mix things over time, I can tell where my users are. Yes?
Yeah, having created that user in that database with a password.
How?
Having created it, is there any equivalent of like SD help rev login to script that out for your own purposes?
All right, so for this contained user, is the equivalent of SP help rev login. I haven't seen one as of yet, but it shouldn't matter. You shouldn't need that because this is a contained user, right? So if I move the database, the user moves with it.
Yeah.
SP help rev login exists because if I move the database, I have to figure out what the old password is, right? What you're kind of asking, is there some way to reverse engineer the password? You can't because it's a one-way hash. SP help rev login doesn't give me the password, right? It recreates the hash.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to recreate the password. But just for example, transferring those user ID and password onto another database on another server, perhaps UAT server where it's not a contained database.
Well, typically you'd back up and restore there, right? Potentially you could,
There's normal database script you can
oops, I know what I did wrong. Let me just see, I'm just curious what it's in here. So I assume I might be able to just do a transfer here of all the information. Yeah, it's got a password and all there. That's a good question. I don't know how you might transfer that over. Backup and restore. All right, I think I did a backup. Let's just see. I did. So I back up again. Actually, I want to delete that one. Just for the sake of doing it. Did I actually put it over here? So I think I ran a backup while he was talking. I did. So let's copy that back over here to my new instance again. So I'm duplicating what we just did just for the sake of demonstration purposes. I've got the restore here. I'm going to restore this as a new database. Did I remove it? I did. All right. Change our connection. We'll come over here to our new instance. And we'll do a restore. I mean, there's nothing, this is just a scripted restore because you guys don't need to see that restore dialog again, right? You don't really care. All right, we'll go up here. If I use my database, I gave it a new name and I run my script here, it should work, right? It's contained user. He's not dependent on that principal at the server level, so it works fine. But here's kind of the interesting thing, right, that works well is that this user doesn't exist anywhere. If I copy this password and I change this connection, I did Windows authentication here just so that I could show you with this password. I've specified initial catalog here. I connect, I get an error SQL prompt because it doesn't, users that are contained don't have all the metadata access that's needed. That's Richard's fault. He worked on SQL prompt, so he's going to fix that next week, right? Hey, there's ladies present, all right? Watch your mouth. But I logged in and I connected here, and where's my table? And I run my query and it works fine, logging in as a user, and on this instance, I have no login that exists with that name, right? I've solved that security problem. And you should, if you go to 2012, you should use contained users right now because there's no penalty for using a contained user in any database or using it on your instance. It'll work just fine. Yes, sir?
Will it work just fine if you're doing cross-database queries? How is it going to...
So cross-database queries aren't then contained. You're going outside of containment, right? The reason that they built this and the reason that's coming to a head now is because Azure works like this, right? That you cannot go across databases. Every database is a different connection. That's the idea here, that under load, I ought to be able to move this database to any other instance without causing problems, right? And I assume at some point, just like in Azure, if there's a failure, your database moves to another copy and you don't know about it, that we'll be able to do this on premises with SQL Server. This is the first step for that. Cross-databases query doesn't work. Cross-database queries do not work because you're breaking containment, okay? So there's a caveat there, but you can still create the login, create the contained user. If they match up, you'll go to that server level authentication, right? Especially if you use Windows level logins. It doesn't hurt you to do this. Does that make sense? Does it not make sense? Yes, sir.
If you're doing some kind of, if you're deploying a development, someone's done and they're using a specific login, then this would come in handy because it will work.
Right.
If you move the database across without moving the login. Correct?
Yes, so in development, if you create logins and you move the database from one instance to another one, then this allows you to do that without worrying about the login piece.
Probably one of the reasons why they've done this.
Yes. I mean, it just, right, it makes my phone stop ringing. That's why they did it, okay? That's what we want to do here. Somebody else?
Is there anything in connection properties to show that we're at a contained user connection? Opposed to
That's a good question. Let's see. Let me just flip over. Oops. What do I want to look at? What is it? TM.
Exec.
It's exec, right?
DM exec. Sessions.
That's what it is. So, I'd have to see, where's my thing? Hold on. Where am I, 55? Where am I there? So 55. So my login name doesn't appear here actually. Right? I think I'm just tokenized here. I'm kind of faked because I don't really have a login name. So I think that this would probably clue you in, right? That it's not a real value. As far as scripting that out, you'd have to look and see. I'm trying to think if there's something that's changed here. So the original login name, but that doesn't really tell you that it's contained or. That's what it is.
yeah, thinking about the ANSI settings, changes to the plans and stuff, you would.
I don't think there's anything in the settings that would tell you, but this login name I think might be the thing that clues you in to say it's not a real name, unless that's your name.
Is there anything, if you go back to the connection you have and go to the properties window for that, does it show anything in here for the connection? It's got connection name, but I don't know if that indicates that it's login name.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything in here I've seen.
No.
So My guess is there may be a hole here,
Yeah.
right? There's probably some ways to figure it out, but I don't know if it's
Well, it's
really well done.
Have a look.
the authenticated, when you went to the list, it was the authenticated database. When it was 1, that said it was at server level because that's master.
Oh, and it was, this one was 7 because it was the new database, yeah.
So when it's not 1, it's contained.
So there's probably something you have to just query to see. All right. That's really it for security, right? It's not a big deal, not that hard, it works fine. Just contain your users, and then as you move databases around, as long as you've specified the initial catalog, you should connect in fine. If I don't specify the initial catalog, it will fail. It will say I can't find a login. If I move this connection, where's my connection? And we'll use the same password, which I think is still here. Yep. And let's just go to, let's just say master, right? Obviously it'll fail. If I say default, it should fail as well. Okay, so I've got to specify initial catalog. That's one of those things you should be doing it anyways. You should always be doing it, especially as we move to things like mirroring and always on. You want to specify those things in there to make sure that when you connect, you're determining if you're read-write, if you're read-only, you're connecting to the proper database. It's just a good habit to get into.
I like that middle option, unload all your databases. That sounds a good one.
Yeah. All right, collation. So I'm going to create a new database here. Let me connect. Always good to connect to a database. I'm going to go back to my first instance just because. All right, create a new database. Of course, it always exists. We don't want to do that. Let's get rid of it, say that you actually believe that I can create a database. All right, I chose Japanese collation for no particular reason. Thank you. It does help to use the correct name. There we go. Yes. Fine, fine, fine. It's picky today. Wow.
Yeah, that's a bug I've found as well. Obviously, you can't connect.
All right, let's pick a query again. All right. Create database, use it, it works. It's always good when it works. So I'm gonna create 2 tables here. They're the same table. One's gonna be in a database, one's gonna be in tempdb. Nothing magic, we're gonna put a row in each one, okay? Now, I hadn't run into this for years and years and years, and I finally did when I first moved the SQL Server Central databases from the US to the UK, so I ran into this. What happens, this is the thing that it just stumped us briefly. If I run this, it works fine. If I run the same select from tempdb, same table, nothing magic. If I run these 2 together, what I end up with is my collation error. Okay, and the reason is that my tempdb is my server level collation and my database is different collation. And so when I look at this is my normal table here in my database. It's the Japanese collation. But if I scroll down and look at tempdb, or my table in tempdb, the exact same table, right? Nothing in there other than create table. It's Latin General 1, which is what my instance is. So I've got a collation conflict. Fixing this is really no big deal. Whoops. I just add a collate clause to one or both statements to fix it. I can make one go one way or one the other way. I just have to decide to do it. In terms of joins, because most of us don't do unions that often, right? I get the conflict there, but if I add the collation and force tempdb to go to collate with my database, it works fine. Okay? Easy to do, but you got to do it. And for those of you that have a lot of code, this is a problem. If I move that database to a different collation instance, and I haven't changed any code, then I'm going to get this error all over the place. Okay? So, what happens if I do this in containment? Here, I'm going to create a contained database, and this time I'm doing containment in the create statement instead of the alter. There's no difference. I mean, it works either way. let's run that. I'm going to create the same two tables. Again, if I run A, it works. If I run B, it works. And if I run both of them together, it works. All right, is that impressive? It's kind of impressive, right? If I run this now, if I look at my tables again, my table in my database is Japanese, and my table in tempdb is Japanese. Tempdb is still Latin 1 general. I haven't changed tempdb, we're on the same instance. But what SQL Server is doing, when I create a temporary object, it's going to add the collate clause itself and collate that temporary object with the collation of my contained database. Does that make sense? Excellent. Any questions?
Excuse me, can you go up for the first step?
Can I go up? Tell me when to
What you
stop.
have done to make it default?
What did I do differently?
No, for this statement.
What I did differently is this.
Create database.
The only difference between,
You put the collection and the database. That's it. Wait.
Yes.
yeah. So the only difference is here I create a database.
What you put?
That's a database, right? And all I did was I take all this code right here, okay? And when I copied it down here, the only thing that changed is this statement. That's the only difference between those two scripts, okay? So it solves collation issues. So if you don't live in the US and you actually care about other languages, then this can solve problems that you might have without rewriting code. You can fix all this stuff if you want to write all your code to say collate whatever. Anybody want to do that? You want to do that? It keep you employed for a long time, dude. I'm telling you. Good for business.
Just run the alter database to partial afterwards.
But you don't get paid very much for that, right? If you change all the code, it's much
Don't
easier.
Do that one. Do the one that's going to cost you money. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, nothing magic there. It's easy stuff, but it works really well for a couple of problems. At some point, hopefully, we fix some other problems. But for now, those are the two things we fix. There's all kinds of restrictions here. Okay. Any of this stuff, replication, CDC, CT, file stream, file table, any of this stuff that breaks containment that works outside of here, you can't have a contained database. It just doesn't work. So there's other restrictions as well. I ran out of slide. But there's links at the end here. If you go in Books Online and look, you'll find out what things will break containment. It's a fairly long list right now. Hopefully that list shrinks in 2018 or I don't know. I don't know when they'll get to it, but you know. All right, containment, done, because I'm running late here, but always on. Anybody using always on? A few people, that's cool. I had one guy yesterday and like twice as many people here is using it. It's very cool technology. All right, new in 2012. It's HADR, high availability disaster recovery kind of combined together. In fact, the code name was HADRON, high availability disaster recovery on. I mean, it was Hadron. And actually some of the DMV stuff still says Hadron in it. Okay. Now it's called always on because the marketing people like that better. It's really what mirroring should have been a while ago. It gives us a bunch of advantages that I'll talk about. It kind of blends mirroring and log shipping a little bit. Technically, that's not what happens, but the way it behaves is similar to that. The other thing to remember is always on isn't a technology. Always on doesn't exist. There's no always on button or configuration. Always on really consists of two technologies. There's availability groups called AGs and FCIs, failover clustered instances. Not clustering that we've typically been used to in the past in SQL Server, but a separate new type of clustering, kind of an evolution. Is that fair? That's a fair description. I know this is harder to read in here. This is kind of the maxed out configuration, what this means, and I just want to describe a few things. Here I've got 5 nodes listed, and there's a reference for where this came from. You can read more about it. The first 2 nodes are in a traditional cluster. Shared storage, clustered SQL Server there. And in these nodes, I've actually got my primary database. Here, I've actually got additional nodes, 3 additional nodes that exist with not shared storage. These are still part of the same FCI cluster, okay? 5 nodes in this cluster, but 3 of them are not shared storage. What's even cooler, if you've ever set up clustering, is these 2 nodes, it says, are on a separate subnet, a separate network subnet. They don't even have to be physically in the same country, not the same hosting provider, not the same anything, all right? Separate network. What I do is I can create an availability group, which is 1 or more databases. I'll have a primary, and it will replicate across to what we now call replicas. Instead of trying to figure out who's primary, secondary, all that, we now have a primary and we have replicas. And I can have multiple replicas here, not just one, as in mirroring we've had in the past. We can have multiple of these. I also create an availability group network name, similar to the virtual server we've had in the past. Not quite the same, but it works in a similar manner, where I've got a name that can exist across multiple nodes, okay? Make this a little simpler, I get 4 replicas. I can have 1 primary and up to 4 replicas. The replicas can be readable all the time. Not readable like log shipping only when I'm not restoring. They're readable all the time. I don't have to kick anybody off a reporting server to actually continue to update that reporting server, all right? Happens automatically. What's more, I can have synchronous or asynchronous or a combination of both. I get up to 2 synchronous replicas, and I can have up to 4 asynchronous replicas. Now, I only get 4 replicas, so I gotta, if I have 2 synchronous, I only get 2 asynchronous. But I can have up to 4 replicas. What does this mean for us? One more thing. Here I've got multiple nodes. I've got my primary I can have multiple availability groups on a node. So availability group is 1 or more databases, but I can have multiple of those on there. So in SQL Server Central, we have 4 databases that run the site. I can put all those in one availability group. What that means is if node 1 fails, node 2 can pick up and all 4 of my databases come live on there. If I've got 4 databases on 4 LUNs and 1 LUN fails, all 4 databases on failover will move to the other node and become the primaries. So if you've got multiple database applications, you don't have to worry about manually figuring out how to fail other things over. Everything will move over for you, okay? You also can do the active-active thing. If you could read this, these 2 are primaries, this is a primary. So I can spread out and have primaries on different nodes in the same cluster. Make sense? That's what you're doing, right?
It is.
What does this mean to us as a comparison? All the HADR technologies are kind of here, mirroring, asynchronous, everything. The nice thing is always on really kind of blends all these things together, okay? Not only do you get very low RPO, very low RTO, but I also get readability on my secondaries, okay? And I get multiple ones. So it's kind of what we wish mirroring had done before, that I could read the secondary and I could have more than 1 copy, okay, in case I have problems. No shared storage is huge, right? It means no HCL list. It means I don't even have to have the same vendor. I don't have to have the same model. I can have a really big primary database server that handles my load, and I spread out copies for reporting to other servers. I could have a small OLTP server, and I could have a really big fat secondary that handles tons of reporting for me. Okay? You can mix and match however you want. That's a big deal. I can also take log backups off my replicas. I can move my backups to a different server, which is kind of nice. I don't have to put that load on the primary server, especially if I have a really big database. If I run a backup, I use compression, it spikes my CPU, right? Just what compression does. I can offload that to a secondary server now. What's more is I can set up the different nodes that I have to say, do backups here or do not do backups here. I have a lot of configuration options. So why don't you just everybody do this? Well, first of all, Neil's really expensive, okay?
Yes.
He is, okay? He's worth it, but he is. Licensing costs, okay? We now only get 1 passive node. So if I have a synchronous node in my same data center for quick failovers, and I have 1 for DR, in the past I could say I'm not using either one of those, so I don't have to pay for them. Now you do, okay? You can only have 1 passive node that you don't license for. If you set up 2 or 3 DR nodes for whatever reason, you've got to license all of them after the first one.
It's 1 passive for every enterprise, for every license you're paying for. So if you've got one, you can have one passive.
Oh, okay,
Have
so
two, you can have, you've got.
2 passive. Okay, so
goes
one
to
per
5.
one per license.
Yeah, so you'd have to pay for 3 if you want the 4 additional seconds.
Right.
That's for free.
Right, but if you use them for reporting, though, you got to pay for them, okay, because they're in use. Even though they're just copies, they're read-only, whatever, you still got to pay for them. Really, you can only do log backups. Now, you could do copy-only backups, but if you count on differential backups, if that's part of your scheme to reduce your recovery time, you can't do those on secondary nodes. They got to come off the primary mode. The other thing is there's only one backup chain. So my full plus my diff plus my logs, there's only one chain. So if I back up a full on my primary, a log on my secondary 1, and a different log on my secondary 2, I've got to get all 3 of those files together to recover the system. Okay? Again, it's not really hard, but you got to think about it. You got to plan out. I've got to get all my log backups to a central location for recovery. Okay? If I count on all my log backups on node 2 and node 2 disappears because my SANT administrator deleted the LUN, I don't have a recovery chain. Okay? Can't go back to the primary for that. It is a little bit complex. I wouldn't say it's hard, but it's complex. There's a lot of little moving parts here. There's really good documentation. It just takes some practice, and you got to work at it, and you got to practice recovering it. Okay? Your database level failover is kind of nice. It's good and bad. The thing is that all the databases in the availability group are not in lockstep according to time. Okay? I'm still database by database. I'm transferring those logs across or the transactions across. So potentially on failover, one database has completely committed transactions, one has transactions in flight, and I've got to roll those back on failover because I'm not making sure that at 319 all my transactions are across. Okay, it's database by database. All right? Probably not a big deal for most of us, but if you're in a application that has really, really low latency requirements, it could be a problem. Be aware. What do we do if we put these together? Well, it's nice for a few things. One is the security issue, right? I don't have to worry about this on the different nodes if I've got containment. They just work together. The second thing is I can mix collations. If I've got multiple different pieces of hardware and I want to try to utilize these together, and I've got multiple databases on there that are different collations, it's not an issue. If I add a new node and I happen to require Japanese collation for this database, I can still make it part of my FCI cluster even though every other node runs SQL Latin General 1. Okay? As long as I'm using contained databases, it solves those problems for me. Or you can rewrite all your code. It's up to you. And then it fails over. It fails over really, really nicely from node to node. At Redgate, for our products, for the last couple of minutes of our infomercial, we work with always on fine. We work with contained databases fine for the most part. Backup works fine. It just runs. One of the recommendations always on is you have the same backup scheme on every node because if you fail over, obviously you want backups to still occur. Right? You don't want to count on backups on node 2 occurring and node 2 disappears. You want them to be able to pick up on node 3 or node 1 or whatever. With Backup Pro, we do things called templates, so we make it really easy for you to set up the same jobs on all these servers. You have to figure out the enable, disable piece of that, script that. We don't do that. We also don't read the flag on different nodes that says do a backup here and not do a backup here. So you've got to manually manage that piece of it. But the compression, the encryption, all that stuff just works. Storage compress works great with this. If you're trying to add on a bunch of scale out nodes here and you're worried about space especially because I've got a 12 terabyte database for my primary but everybody wants to report off it, you can use something like storage compress to compress those databases. The natural evolution of storage compress, though, is that you start at dev, you move to test, you move to production. Here you might move to your secondaries, make sure you're comfortable with the way it works, and move to production. It works fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with storage compress, but you test things before you put them in production, right? And this would allow you to kind of slide that into production. And then monitor, of course, will monitor fine. Right? You can add any custom queries in there to see which is the active node or not the active node, and that kind of thing. You should kind of use this now. If you're going to 2012, use containment. Right? There's not really a big penalty, especially if you're thinking about doing hybrid applications or you're thinking about doing anything with Azure or AWS or anything else. Containment will build good habits. It will teach you to code better and be prepared for things like I'm moving to another node, or that I have to worry about, or I don't want to have to worry about security, things like that. What might be coming in the future, I can't, I don't know what they're working on. Hopefully they're working on something, I don't know. You never know with Microsoft. They may deprecate this next time, you never know. But you would think they would put some of these things in there, like link servers, right? That should be easy to add to a contained database. There's a name and a password, that's easy, right? It's not adding the query part of the link server, it's the other side of the link server that's a problem. How do I find the database I'm linking to if it moves to a different instance? Any number of ways to do that, right? I mean, we broadcast the network name across nodes now with the FCIs, or virtual servers, but it's a little different scale to do it at link servers. And so somebody has to work out the directory services piece of this. Same thing for Service Broker. There's various ways to do that, but Microsoft has to decide, how am I going to do the other side of the containment if I'm moving the database you're trying to get to, right? Whether it's the queue or the database or whatever. As far as maintenance plans, jobs, automation, things like that, there's nobody from Microsoft in here, so I can say this. They have no excuse for not having that in place right now. It's silly. Every database I have should be able to tell me what its backup requirements are, what its indexing requirements are. When I attach it to an instance, it could easily read up and say, I need a backup every night, create the job, enable it, go. If I run the job and the database is gone, just delete the job or disable the job. That's really not hard to do. And frankly, it's embarrassing that it's not done already. Okay, there goes my MVP. That's all right.
Master target servers help with some of the job stuff, but it's still not a full.
It's not. There's no excuse why it shouldn't be inside the database. I would expect in the next version that at least maintenance and probably backups are inside the contained database already, and that you will actually store the properties for when you do full backups, log backups, indexing, all that stuff inside the database, and the instance will figure out when to run it. Okay. Hopefully it happens. I don't know what else they might do. There's probably any number of things you guys run into that you need that could be there. If you have ideas, suggestions, things that are important to you, let Microsoft know. And connect.microsoft.com is where you can let them know. You can say, why don't you have this in a database? Or when is this going to be contained? All right, that's it. I'm out of time. I've got 12 seconds left, according to the US Watch, which is the important one. If you have questions, please ask me. Come out, find me outside. I'll be here all day. Tip your waiters. You can go ahead and go. That's fine. Fill out your evaluations. Fabulous prizes to be had at 5 o'clock after your free beer, your free wine, free soft drinks, free water. Water's usually free. Resources here. And again, this talk will be up, I don't know, somewhere. SQLinthecity.redget.com at some point in time. So thanks for coming. Hopefully you guys had a great day. And see you next time. That's not mine.